microphone, introduce yourself. It's coming, right behind you.
Asante sana. Monsieur Pomfret, merci beaucoup. Est-ce que nous pouvons 请问为什么美国非常讨论社会革命？因为在耶鲁大学我学过，美国的革命是一个政府革命，不是社会革命。
Okay, I think we need a translation.
Okay, can I translate?
Sure.
At Yale, I studied that the American Revolution was a political revolution, not a social revolution. You're familiar with that literature? Okay, so the answer that we had at Yale was that we were going to have a polycentric world. We were no longer going to have US hegemony. We were going to have Europe, China, the US, Africa, South America, maybe Japan would be separate somewhere, maybe Australia. We kind of divide the world up into continents and islands. And now we're kind of doing the same thing. You know, the UK has seceded. We've got UK, Japan, Europe, you know, Russia. I'm not sure where all of Central Asia and the Middle East falls in. You know, I guess at least we're trying not to have a two-state policy. We're trying to have peace in the Middle East, maybe at least partly. What do you think? You know, if you were going to try to do that beautiful diagram of Napoleon's march, you know, to Russia and back, and try to discuss with statistics your history, how would you explain US foreign policy in terms of whether the American Revolution was a 社会革命 or a 政府革命?
Wow, okay, we've got the sweep of history in response to a book about the sweep of history. So,
that's a question about American history, and I'm okay on American history, but I'm a little bit better on Chinese history. It's kind of weird, but it's true. That said, and on Chinese history, it's interesting, made a point about the Chinese sort of putting themselves out as the defender of globalization. And it's partially because I think no other country in the world has benefited more from globalization than the Chinese and than China. And I think that's clearly an indication. And it's now they're worried about it. And so One Belt, One Road and all these other ideas that they're throwing out is a way to continue that globalization story, despite the fact that we have, you know, the world beginning to seem to spin into disarray with the Brits leaving the EU and us seemingly wanting to close our doors. So the Chinese, in a way, are the last standard bearer of this system that benefited greatly and basically enabled their rise over the past 50 years. I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, there's a lot of talk that we're seeing peak globalization, or that we're seeing globalization in retreat. Do you buy into that?
You know, it might be in retreat in the industrial world, but you know, in India, they seem to be very focused on the idea. Now, India and China have to work out their issues, and that looks increasingly fraught after a short period of hope. But the Chinese want to be the new standard bearer, and I think a lot of the sort of the future of the globalization, ironically, depends on China, which is basically a mercantilist power. So there's no shortage of ironies here.
The question right there.
Thanks very much, Paul Newrider from Amgen. Good to see you, John. I would take issue with China being the greatest beneficiary of the globalization in the world. That's, I think, a separate issue. It is a bit challenging for Xi Jinping to be overseas claiming that China is the new champion of globalization. After all, you know, 5 years before Trump came along, Xi Jinping himself had, to the extent they have an internal campaign, was preaching the glories of the China dream. The best translation of that is make China great again. So their exports keep taking over. To what extent do you see China's ability? You mentioned China's mercantilist power, but to what extent do you see China recognizing that it must change that mercantilist position? That to some extent its actions have, you know, brought forth a reaction from the U.S. and other countries, and that they do need to continue that change, because they talk a good game when they're outside of China, but I see very little talking inside of China what's necessary.
So that's a great question, and like many things right now, it's very unclear actually the direction that the Chinese will take, as it's unclear the direction we're going to take in this dance that we have with them, and in China's dance with the rest of the world as well. And so, several years ago, you had, as you know, a very ambitious Chinese reform program announced, where they were going to be taking apart their state-owned enterprises and doing X, Y, and Z, and opening their economy more to the outside world, etc. But nothing's happened really since 2012 when they announced these changes. And you see in China these announcements, as we've noted, in Davos and in Peru, about being a much more open economy. But the reality is that inside China, there's still this push to create national champions, which will outcompete foreign companies by using a variety of, in China, sort of nurturing monopolies, which then will go out and buy their competitors. And right now, I don't really see that fundamental model changing. One, because I think that Xi Jinping believes that state-owned champions are the foundational force of the power of the Communist Party. And secondly, I also believe that he looks at the Brexit and the American election as a sign of Western weakness, and that without things like the TPP and a renewed push from the West for globalization, he can actually afford not to do some things that he probably would have been forced to have done should the TPP and the Europeans stay together. And actually, our disarray gives him the opportunity to hive countries off and to deal with them separately and not as a bloc. And I think that our disarray is a real of great benefit to him. In the long term, China will probably suffer because of it, but politically, it actually in many ways strengthens his hand, because he can say, look at the foreigners, they're dangerous, we have to focus on the rule of the Communist Party. But in the long term, I don't think it's a benefit to China to have continued to pursue this policy. But again, internally in China, there's all these special interests that fight against more fundamental economic change as well. And you look at it from like simple things like privatizing the Chinese Basketball Association, right, which was something that Yao Ming, the great Houston Rockets center, was pushing in China, and he got shot down for something that is, this is not national security, and actually would have made their Olympic team a lot better. But even that's very difficult to do in China these days, too.
To be fair, baseball owners have had their own history in terms of taking on powers in the U.S. and professional sports in general. I wonder, there's this question that's kind of hanging over the relationship right now, is that, every day I'm getting a new note from an economist somewhere in the world saying, beware of the coming trade war with China. How likely is a trade war?
So, again, that's guesswork, but it seems that the 45% flat tariff on all Chinese goods is not going to happen, right, at least for the time being. Yay. So, we've avoided that. But then, you know more than I do, but the border tax seems a possibility. And so that will affect China, like it, of course, is already affecting Mexico, which is going to be inevitable. Will the Chinese begin to take tit-for-tat kind of retribution? Yes, they know how to do that pretty well. Boeing might lose some orders. Apple might find itself squeezed. There's a variety of levers and strings that the Chinese have to pull. Whether that metastasizes into a trade war, I think, is sort of an open question. But I think there's no doubt that the frictions are going to come. Now, that said, the Chinese are interested in trying to, fend off these problems. So, Jack Ma did not go to Trump Tower because Jack Ma is Jack Ma. He went there because he was sent by someone. And so the Chinese are reaching out to the extent that they can, looking very much at what Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, is doing with the United States as a potential model to try to fend off. My guess is you're going to probably see Chinese companies magically invest in the heartland. There's substantial investment still, but there's going to be more. Yeah. And so on this front, the Chinese will be taking actions to try to sort of to feather the nest, and specifically among Trump's base in order to push perhaps the dial in a more positive direction.
How's Xi Jinping's golf game?
I don't know about that. I don't know. He likes soccer very much. He's obsessed with soccer. He plays it almost every day. I don't think he's a golfer.
Question back there.
Hi, thank you. Danica Harvey with Department of Homeland Security. I'm wondering, going off that trade war question, if you can speak a bit about Peter Navarro and what you think our challenges and opportunities are moving forward with someone like that in the administration who, quite frankly, has pretty radical and pessimistic views of China.
So, it's difficult to tell exactly how much influence Peter Navarro is a fellow who's running the National Trade Council. He's an economist from the University of California, Irvine. And he's written a series of books. He's also done a documentary that accuses, basically, with titles like Death by China. So you can figure out kind of the general vibe of what he thinks. And so he believes in a flat tax on everything Chinese, and he believes that the Chinese are the source of most of the evil in the United States. In that sense, he kind of falls into a category of people who've always been afraid of China back into the 1870s. But I don't know how powerful the National Trade Council is going to be, and his ideas, whether they will have tractions or not in the Trump administration. I think it's still very much an open question. And there's all sorts of other people in the administration who have different views. As a friend of mine in the National Security Council described it, he said the whole China policy is like a huge bowl of spaghetti with all of last week's leftovers in it. And the problem is, as you're eating it, you don't know whether you're eating Tuesdays or Wednesdays leftover as you eat it. And it's just, it is clearly a team of rivals. One of the challenges is that, of course, Trump is not Abraham Lincoln, but there is a broad spectrum of views, and Navarro represents one on the radical fringe, but there's lots of people in the center, and even some people more towards, if you will, like the right. I would look at Navarro as being sort of very leftist populist in an interesting way.
Any other questions out there on the floor? You've already had your turn.
I have my turn. How about a follow-on in English?
Let's just see if there's anyone else who wants to ask a question here. Right over there on the left.
Thank you. Rosemary O'Brien with CF Industries. Could you speak to the issue of pollution and air quality in China? There was a really interesting report that came out on Monday saying for certain industries there would be this capacity reduction every year at certain times of the year. And how serious are the Chinese about their air quality issues?
So, great question. Pollution is the #1 or #2 cause of social instability in China. It causes a lot of protests. And the government, and it's also a huge issue among the middle class. So my wife's Chinese. We were living in China into August, and we're pollution refugees because we just couldn't inflict that pollution, Beijing's pollution, on our kids anymore. But we have the ability to get out of China, but many people don't. And so it's a huge cause of anti-government agitation in China. And so from that perspective, the government is very interested in trying to limit the pollution problem. And in some areas, they've had successes. So sulfur dioxide from coal-fired power plants has really been significantly decreased. Because in the past, the coal-fired power plants didn't turn on their scrubbers because they don't want us to pay the electricity costs. Now they turn on the scrubbers. And so their acid rain challenges in northern China are significantly lower than the past. So there are steps that are, in terms of gas refinery. Within 5 years, the quality of the gas in China is no longer going to be the worst gas in the world, or the second worst gas in the world. It might be like the 4th or 5th worst gas in the world, but that will have a positive effect on the pollution situation in China. And so they look at it as a social stability issue, and they're focusing on it. And secondly, on the other side, they're very interested in renewable energy, energy technology being a source of profit for their national champions. And so they put an enormous amount of money into solar and wind. Pretty much every city you go to in China has an electric vehicle program, and some of them are boondoggles. but they're obviously going to have a hit on one or two of these areas. And so there's they look at it both as a social stability issue, but also as a potential issue of profit. And so I think they're relatively serious about it. That said, they still believe that they have to keep the economy growing, right? And that often, the environmental needs bump up against the requisites of keeping the economy chugging along. And often when the economy slips, they'll throw money into the infrastructure sector, which then creates more cement, et cetera, which has a bad knock-on effect on pollution.
Just one more question. I think it's going to have to be our. We'll take these two questions there, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Kenya.
First of all, I want to thank you for your very interesting historical view of U.S.-China trade. Sometimes I think we live in ahistorical times, and context is always good. I wanted to see what your thoughts were about RCEP and how that fits into history and context and moving forward into the 21st century. All right, Eric Trachtenberg, McCarty Associates.
Why don't we just quickly take the second question there as well, and we'll group them together there.
I normally wouldn't ask this question, but because Levinson brought such an expert, and because you have a shortage of hands, let me put it on the table. We do a lot of work in Africa. There's some assumption that China is a threat to us in Africa. China does infrastructure, immigration, sowing up natural resources, and so on. What are Chinese objectives in Africa? Maybe it's to rebuild the old fleet they used to have, 100,000 and stuff. And two, is it something that the U.S. should view really as a threat, or is there opportunities for cooperation? Thank you.
Okay. So on RCEP, you look at RCEP is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that the Chinese have rolled out, a template for trade relations with the rest of Asia. And you look at RCEP as China's response to the TPP. And now that the sound of one hand clapping is no sound at all, the Chinese are going to push that as the alternative, and countries around Asia are going to be interested in being involved in it. And again, but if you look at it, and if you look at some of the details, it's mostly basically a larger version of a free trade agreement that doesn't really deal in trade of services, it deals mostly in stuff. And it's China's way of trying to push as much of its commodities, much of its products on other countries, and getting the lowest tariff possible, and doing the least amount possible for those countries, selling into China. And so, that's generally their game. And it's a lot less significantly ambitious than, of course, TPP, which had labor and environmental and trades and services. But it's their version, and it will benefit them as they go forward. And without another agreement, other countries like the Australians and the Kiwis, and of course the Filipinos are going to be involved in it because China's going to be the biggest dog on the block. And so from that perspective, it's going to be able to set the rules for how Asia will interact on an economic level. In Africa, the Chinese are interested in Africa for two basic reasons. I mean, there's a third reason, which is geopolitics, which I think is of secondary importance. I mean, they do have their naval installation in Djibouti, but that's not major. First, it's a resource play. It's a way for them to assure iron ore, uranium sources. And secondly, it's also a huge area where they can export their excess production, both in terms of their services, their engineering services, also some of their labor, and also move their textile plants to a place where the labor is cheaper than it is in China. Because the Chinese now have huge textile corporations. They're no longer doing it on behalf of others, they're doing it on behalf of themselves. And so from that perspective, I don't really think they're a threat to the United States in Africa. They're doing business there. In a way, the U.S.-China dialogues on Africa in the past have actually been quite productive on working with the Chinese on corporate responsibility issues, helping them tweak their policies, trying to get them to stop, giving large suitcases of cash to a variety of African leaders, which has been an issue there. But I don't look at it as something that is a threat. Their benefit is not necessarily, it's not a zero-sum game. And Americans who look at it like that, I think, are missing a lot of the picture.
If you could join me in thanking John Pomfret for a fascinating start to the morning.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Shawn. I neglected to say before your remarks, John, John will be signing copies of his book at the bottom of the stairs. We're going to take a very short break right now, just about 3 or 4 minutes tops, to change over the stage and get ready for our first panel discussion. And John will be taking the conversation downstairs if anyone wants to buy the book. Thanks again, John.
Thank you.